There have been times in my life when I've responded to people and situations in anger and just kind of created a mess of things. And I'm guessing that if I could sit down across the table from you and we're having a cup of coffee, I'm guessing that every single one of you hearing this message, you could describe to me a time when anger got the best of you. And that's our theme today as we begin this new series called How to Wreck Your Life. And I'm really excited that you're here today as we jump into the fall and as we jump into this series that I think is going to be very, very practical and yet also at the same time very, very challenging to every single one of us. And over the next 6 weeks, we're going to be talking about 6 common ways that people wreck their lives. And the goal behind this series is not to help you wreck your life, but maybe for us to learn some things together that will help us to make the kinds of decisions that will keep us from wrecking our lives. And let me just encourage you to make it a priority to be here all 6 weeks of this series. And if you can't make it on Sunday morning, take advantage of Sunday night, 6 o'clock at our Dixon City campus. Well, today as we begin, we're going to talk about this first way to wreck your life, which is to let anger consume you. And if you let anger consume you, it will wreck your life. Anger can wreck your life. And many of you here today don't need to hear that in a message because you've seen it in your life. You know it personally. I mean, some of you have family members who will not speak to each other anymore because of anger that was handled poorly. Some of you could talk about a job that you lost because of anger. There are people hearing this message who are married and you're considering leaving your spouse because there's just a deadness and an emptiness to your marriage. There's no intimacy left. And if you could trace it all the way back to the root, at the root of it all is anger that has not been handled well. Some of you could talk about a time when you said something very hurtful to someone that you care about, maybe one of your kids, and you wish that you could take it back. You wish that you could undo the damage, but you can't. Some of you, if you're honest, would say that you have a hard time maintaining friendships because deep down inside of your heart, there's an undercurrent of anger and it just kind of seeps out of you in sarcastic words and a negative attitude, and it's just hard for people to be around you. And see, there are so many ways that anger can wreck our lives, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so we want to talk about how to keep anger from wrecking our lives. And if I could take everything that I'm hoping to communicate in about the next 30 minutes, and if I could boil it down to one simple statement, it would simply be this. Don't just be angry. Be good and angry. And here's what I mean by that. Anger in itself is not necessarily bad. You know, God created us as human beings with the capacity to feel anger. It's a God-given emotion that just rises up within us in certain circumstances. And here's the thing, the right kind of anger, handled the right way, can actually motivate us to do some very good things. And so anger isn't always a bad thing. In fact, the Bible says very clearly that God himself is sometimes angry. Now, there are over 100 verses of Scripture that speak directly about God's anger. And, of course, God's Son, Jesus, when he was here on this earth, he also expressed anger on more than one occasion. I'll give you one example from the Gospel of Mark in chapter 3. It says, he, Jesus, looked around at them in anger, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. And he was looking around at that moment at the religious leaders because one thing you have to understand is that almost every time Jesus was angry, he was angry with religious people who were standing in the way of people who needed to have a relationship with God. So God himself is angry at time to time. Jesus was angry. So anger isn't a bad thing. And by the way, some people struggle with this idea of God's anger. And some people say, you know what, I don't believe in a God of anger. I believe in a God of love, but here's what you need to understand. You can't have a God of love without having a God of anger. Because if you love something, then you're going to be angry at whatever it is that might threaten that thing that you love. And if you don't if you don't have anger toward anything, that means that you don't love anything. And so God is a God of love, and because of that, he is also a God of anger, but his anger is always a righteous anger. So anger, in and of itself, is not necessarily a bad thing. But here's our challenge. The challenge for all of us is being angry for the right reason, in the right way, to the right degree, at the right time. Because we are imperfect people, and our hearts are corrupted by sin. And even though God's anger is always a righteous anger, our anger rarely is a righteous anger. I mean, it's really, really hard for us to be angry and to be good and angry at the same time. And here's what's so interesting to me. The people with whom it's most difficult for us to manage our anger, the people at whom we direct unhealthy anger the most, are the people that we love the most. Isn't that crazy? Like people in our families. I'll give you an example of this. My older brother, years ago sent me an email about raising kids. It's when my kids were younger, and it said this: many people in America think it improper to spank children, so I've tried other methods to control my kids when they have one of those moments. One method that I found effective is for me to just take the child for a car ride and talk. They usually calm down and stop misbehaving after our car ride together. I've included a photo below of one of my sessions with my son in case you would like to use the technique. And then the picture at the bottom of the email is that. And it's really hard to manage anger well, isn't it? Especially with the people who are closest to us. So let me give you a roadmap for where we're going to go today and throughout this series. Throughout this series, we're going to learn and focus our attention on the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs is right about in the middle of the Bible. Let me tell you a little bit about this particular part of the Bible. Proverbs actually is one of my favorite books in the Bible because it's so simple and it's so practical, and yet at the same time, the wisdom in this book of the Bible is incredibly profound. Proverbs, what it is it is a collection of brief sayings about how life works. A proverb is a soundbite. It's a pithy statement about the way that life generally works. And the theme throughout the book of Proverbs is wisdom, how to live wisely, how to live well. In fact, this is the opening sentence in the book of Proverbs. It says, "The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel." And here's why I put these together, he says, "for gaining wisdom." And so the whole purpose of the book of Proverbs is to help us gain wisdom. In fact, the word wisdom is used 55 times in the book of Proverbs. Now, wisdom is something all of us need, and I think all of us know that wisdom and knowledge are two different things, right? I mean, we all know really smart people who make really dumb decisions. And it's not that they were lacking in knowledge or information, it's they were lacking in wisdom. It's not an issue of book smarts, sometimes it's just an issue of street smarts. Because knowledge is about having information. Wisdom is about knowing how to use that information. In fact, one of the best summaries I've ever seen about the difference between the two is this: knowledge is knowing a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad. All right, you can write that down. You can tweet that because that is good stuff right there. So Proverbs is all about wisdom. And wisdom is something that all of us need. And by the way, around here, we encourage you all the time to make reading the Bible a habit of your life. And if you don't already do that, here's a great place to start by reading the book of Proverbs. And it's structured in a great way to do that because Proverbs has 31 chapters. And so what you can do is every day of the month read one chapter, the chapter that coincides with the date. It'll take you about 10 minutes to read a chapter. And then on any given month, you will read most or all of the book of Proverbs. And if you do that for several months in a row, eventually you're going to have like a PhD in wisdom. So Proverbs, great place to start in reading the Bible. Well, today we're going to see what Proverbs has to say about anger and how we manage anger. So I'm going to jump around to different verses throughout these 31 chapters because the Proverbs aren't put together thematically. You find these themes scattered all about. So you probably won't be able to keep up with me in your own Bible or your own Bible app, but that's okay. You can look these up later. I'll just put them on the screen for you. Okay, so as we begin, I think we need to begin by talking about some of the unhealthy ways that we deal with anger. And over the years, as I've worked with people, I've discovered that I think you can boil it all down to three major ways that people deal with anger. Three ways that people deal with anger in unhealthy patterns, okay? So as I talk about these, just kind of see if you can see yourself in any of these three. The first one would be the person I call the trash compactor. Now, when I was a kid, we actually had a trash compactor in the house where we lived. And you don't see it much anymore, but a trash compactor is this machine where you take your trash and you put it in, and then it smashes it down. And then you come back later and you put in more trash and it smashes it down. And you can go for a long time without ever actually taking out the trash. You just put it in and you smash it down. And it works okay for a while, but eventually it starts to stink, and the bag starts to leak, and it just starts to get a little bit nasty. And to be honest, this is the way that some people deal with their hurt, deal with their anger. They just kind of shove it and push it down inside, and it seems to work for a while, but after a while it starts to leak out, and it starts to get a little bit nasty. And dealing with anger this way, man, it can spoil your relationships, and it can spoil your heart, and it can lead to bitterness. Listen to Proverbs 14, verse 10. It says, each heart knows its own bitterness, and no one else can share its joy. And this is simply a statement about life, that you are the only one who fully knows what's in your heart, and you can have bitterness in your heart, and no one else can really know it, because you can have a facade of happiness on the outside, but a spirit of bitterness on the inside. And, sometimes you'll meet a person like this, a trash compactor. And at first, on the outside, everything looks good, kind of like the trash compactor in our kitchen. On the outside, it was always, really shiny and it looked good, but people are like that. But on the inside, there's this bitterness, and as you get to know them over a period of time, it just begins to seep out. And you hear it in their sarcastic words, and you sense it in their negative spirit, and sometimes the way they talk about other people, or maybe the trash compactor, maybe that's you. And here's one reason how you might be able to discern that. You just find yourself getting angry and flying off the handle at things that really aren't all that significant. But see, the problem may be deeper than the thing that in the moment is making you angry. The problem may be that bitterness that's just beneath the surface of your life all the time, and it doesn't take much to trigger it. So there's the trash compactor. The second kind of person is the person that I would describe as the volcano. Like when they're angry, you don't have to guess. You know about it because they erupt, and they erupt all over the place, including all over you. I mean, they curse and they yell and they swear and they squeal the tires. They slam the door. They punch the walls. And oftentimes the volcano kind of person, they'll say, that's just kind of the way I am. I just get it out there and it's over with and I feel better, which may be true. But everybody else around you gets the shrapnel from your anger. Listen to what Proverbs says to all the volcano people out there. It says, fools give full vent to their rage, but the wise bring calm in the end. So if you're a volcano person, you know how the Bible describes you? You're a fool. If you give full vent to your rage, you're a fool. Because it may feel good to you, but it hurts everybody around you. And the truth is, some of you grew up in a home where you had a dad or a mom who dealt with anger this way. They were a volcano, and you still today bear the scars of that, and that may even be part of what drives your own anger. So maybe you're a trash compactor. On the other hand, you might be a volcano. But here's the third way that people deal with anger. They're just some people that I would describe as a stealth bomber, okay? And this is the person who doesn't immediately react, and yet they don't completely bury the hurt either. What this person does is they kind of hang on to the hurt, and you don't really notice it, but then at just the right moment, they kind of, drop their payload on you. The stealth bomber person is the person who's really good at what psychologists call passive-aggressive behavior. Passive-aggressive behavior is someone who can look really cool on the outside, and they're smiling, and they've got a very pleasant demeanor, but then quietly they're just trying to figure out how to even the score, I'll give you an example of that. Here's just fictional example, doesn't really come from real life. You have a fight with your husband, okay, on a Saturday, and you wake up on Sunday morning and you're still mad at him because of the way that he volcanoed all over you on Saturday. So what you decide to do is this. You decide you're just going to take your time getting ready to go to church. And so you just smile and you slowly get dressed and get ready to go to church. And you make your husband wait out in the car for you. And you do that because you know that he's especially compulsive about getting somewhere on time, right? And then eventually you make your way out to the car. And by the time you get there, he is just seething with anger. And you say, honey, why are you so angry? You know, you really shouldn't act that way, especially when we're on our way to church. Target sighted, enemy hit. Okay, that's the stealth bomber. Okay, and if you respond to anger that way, here's a verse from Proverbs for you. Do not say, I'll do to him as he has done to me. I'll pay that man back for what he did. I don't write them, I just read them, okay? Now, I don't know where you find yourself in terms of your natural pattern of dealing with anger, if you're a trash compactor or a volcano or a stealth bomber. Lots of us, to be honest, are just some kind of combination of those three. But here's a very interesting conversation you might be able to have over lunch today. Just ask everybody around the table, hey, you know, who am I? Well, how do I deal with anger? But here's the thing, however you happen to deal with anger, whatever unhealthy way you deal with anger, here's the good news. You can change, because the way we deal with our anger is a learned behavior. Most likely you learned it from your parents. And because it's a learned behavior, you can unlearn it and you can learn a new way to respond to your anger, and you can become good and angry, okay? So if you want to be good and angry, there are 4 things you got to do right from the book of Proverbs. First thing you have to do is this. You got to pause. You got to pause. You know what the very first thing you should do whenever you feel angry? You know what that is? The very first thing you ought to do? You do nothing. Listen to what Proverbs says here in chapter 15. It says, the heart of the righteous weighs its answers, but the mouth of the wicked gushes evil. In other words, the wise person, the righteous person, is the person who knows how to pause before responding. Proverbs 14:17 says this, a quick-tempered man does foolish things. And there's this theme that comes up over and over again in the book of Proverbs, this theme that tells us that if you respond immediately, you will almost always respond poorly. And when you get angry, it distorts your thinking, and you do foolish things that you eventually regret. So the best thing you can do is you pause and you just try to get some emotional objectivity. And that's very hard in our culture today, I've discovered, because one of the dangers of living in this world of email and social media is that it's so easy for us to respond to things immediately and to respond to things with very little thought. And so, you know, you push the send button, or you post that response on your Facebook page, or you tweet out that comment, and then you go back a few hours later and you cringe. And so does everybody else. See, the first thing you got to do is you got to pause, not to ignore the conflict, not to bury the hurt, not to become a trash compactor and get all bitter, but you pause just to get some emotional objectivity and some emotional distance. And in that moment you pray and you say, God, I'm angry. Help me know how to respond. So you pause. And then after you pause, you do this. You got to think. You think about the situation. You look down within and look within your own heart. You think about the person who's making you angry. And I love this verse from Proverbs chapter 20. It says, the purposes of a person's heart are deep waters, but one who has insight draws them out. In other words, the purposes or the motives, the things that drive you, are deep waters. They're buried deep within your heart. But if you're a person with wisdom, if you're a person of insight, you draw those things out. You draw out those purposes, those motives from your own heart and also from the hearts of other people. And whenever you're angry, you got to pause and you got to think. And when you think, I think you need to ask yourself a very, very important question. And this question is a game changer. You ask this question: why am I so angry? What's driving me? What are the purposes of my heart right now in this moment of anger? And that is such a crucial question. And I believe that if you will ask that question and if you will be honest with yourself, here's what you will discover, because I've discovered this about myself, that a lot of our anger is just about us. It's about our pride. It's about ego. It's about our own tiny little kingdom. And the truth is, a lot of our anger just comes from the fact that circumstances didn't line up the way that we wanted our circumstances to line up. Let me give you an example. One of the places where I think I really struggle with anger is in traffic. I mean, I know I'm the only one here who struggles with that, but I do. And a few weeks ago, I was in traffic. I was trying to get somewhere. I was running late and came to an area where there was some construction, okay? And you got two lanes that have to merge into one lane. So I had merged and I was in the correct lane. And I was almost up to where the other lane ends and the orange cones begin. And I wasn't paying attention, and I left a little bit of a gap in front of me. And this guy comes flying up next to me on my left and just scoots right in there in front of me. Okay, I was angry. I was really angry. I hit the horn. I don't mean I tapped the horn. I laid on the horn. I'm yelling at the windshield. I was thinking some very unkind thoughts about that guy. But later on, I had to ponder the purposes of my heart. And I had to ask myself, why is that such a big deal to me? Why does something like that in traffic make me so angry? Because here's the truth. Having one more car in front of me, that wasn't going to delay my arrival by any more than maybe 1 second at the most. So why was I so angry? I'll tell you the conclusion I came to. Because I felt disrespected. Because I felt like he won and I lost. And I felt diminished in that moment. And it was just a pride thing. It was just an ego thing. And you know what? You want a game changer? You pause and you think and you ask yourself, what's going on in my heart? Why am I so angry about this? And here's what I observe in Christian culture today. We get so angry about the smallest of things, and we seem to not care about the things that really anger the heart of God. So you think. But not only do you look within your own heart, I think you've got to try to look within the heart of the other person as well and try to discern, try to ponder what might be driving them. Because here's what I've discovered. When someone does something to hurt me, that a lot of the times it isn't even entirely about me. It's about something else that was going on in their lives. I read a book a few years ago by Craig Groeschel called Confessions of a Pastor. I want you to just listen to something he writes in this book. Okay, just listen. He said, it's a fact that hurt people hurt people. They usually dislike themselves and criticize others in a misguided effort to validate themselves. If one of these injured souls lobs a criticism grenade in your direction, defuse it with understanding. He says, one time I was praying during worship, a few moments before preaching, eyes closed, focusing on God. I felt someone slip a note into my hand. I never saw who it was, but the note was marked personal. I thought to myself, someone probably wrote a nice note to encourage me before I preach. A warm, loving feeling settled over me as I unfolded the paper. A moment later, I lost that loving feeling. Evidently, the note was from a woman who had tried to see me on Friday, my day off. She took offense at my absence and blasted me with hateful accusations. This happened literally seconds before I was to stand up to preach. In that moment, I had a choice. I could internalize the offense and become demoralized and discouraged, or I could ask myself, I wonder what she's experiencing that caused her to lash out. I chose compassion over depression. My heart hurt for her. I knew that such a disproportionate reaction must indicate deep pain, so I didn't take her note personally. Then he ends by saying this, and this is so profound. He says, consider the source and consider the possibility that the jab may have come from an injured heart. Dismiss it and move on. If you don't, you may become the very thing that you despise. You pause. You think about yourself, about the other person, and then you respond. And by the way, you can only respond correctly if you've taken the time to pause and to think. And so when you do respond, how do you respond? Well, there are a couple of different options. One way to respond in anger is to simply overlook the offense and to move on. Listen to what it says here in Proverbs chapter 19. It says, "A man's wisdom gives him patience. It is to his glory to overlook an offense." Now that's so countercultural, because what our culture would say, that to overlook an offense, that's not wisdom, that's weakness. But Proverbs says, Solomon says, no, that's wisdom. It's to your glory to overlook an offense. That sometimes with some things, you just got to let it go. Let it go. Can't hold it back. Never mind. A man's wisdom gives him patience. It is to his glory to overlook an offense. Now, there's a difference between overlooking an offense and stuffing it down inside and becoming bitter. So how do you know? How do you know when to overlook an offense and when to not overlook an offense? Let me give you 3 questions. You got to ask these 3 questions. Number 1, do you find yourself telling other people what was done to you? See, if you're talking to other people about that person and what they did, you probably ought to be talking to that person about what they did. So that's the first question. Second question is this: has it damaged your relationship with them? In other words, do you find that you are more distant? Do you find that you have a hard time being around them? And this is especially important if it's someone who's always been a close friend or who is a family member. Has that relationship changed? Third question is this: should I overlook the offense? Well, do you find yourself dwelling on the offense days or weeks after it happened? Do you just keep thinking about it? I mean, even if you don't choose to, it just keeps resurfacing in your mind. And you have those imaginary conversations where you are brilliant and you humble them and they're in tears asking forgiveness. I mean, do you find yourself dwelling on it? See, one way to respond is to overlook an offense, and you do that when you can. But if you say yes to any of those questions that we just asked, then that is not the appropriate response. The appropriate response is to actually speak up, to say something. And it's amazing to me, there's so many people who, when it comes to dealing with anger, they basically have 2 gears. They go to one of 2 extremes. At the one extreme, they get really mad in their anger and they say things and do things that they regret. But then when they cool down, they're not really willing to deal with the issue that made them so angry in the first place. They either blow up or clam up. But there's a better alternative in terms of a response. If you're not going to overlook it, here's what Proverbs tells us to do in chapter 27. It says, "Better is open rebuke than hidden love." In other words, one of the highest forms of loving another person is to be honest with them, especially when what they're doing may continue to hurt you or hurt other people. That the appropriate response is to be honest and open in your rebuke of them. Well, how do you do that? Another verse in Proverbs tells us how we go about that. In chapter 12, it says, "Reckless words pierce like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing." In other words, when you do find that it's time to speak up and respond, you do it in a way that is thoughtful and careful and gentle, so that your words are more like a scalpel than a sword, because a sword destroys, but a scalpel is what brings healing to a relationship. I came across something that had been written by Charles Swindoll about how to say the truth and how to say it graciously. He said this. He said, "Years ago, I used to sell shoes. My seasoned employer, with a twinkle in his eye, instructed me never to say, 'Lady, your foot is too big for this shoe.' I was taught to say instead, 'I'm sorry, but this shoe is just a little too small for your foot.' Both statements expressed the facts, but one was insulting while the other was tactful." You speak the truth. You do it in love. Now, we covered this in much more detail in a series we did back in the spring called "You Drive Me Crazy." And so if you want a little bit more information on how to have one of those conversations where you need to speak the truth in love, you can go back and listen to the second message in that series, okay? So what do? If you want to be good and angry, you stop, you pause, you respond either by overlooking the offense or dealing with it. But then number 4, and this is crucial and this is so difficult, you choose to bless. I mean, this is so countercultural. This is so counterintuitive. This is so rare. But my friends, this is so powerful. It says if your enemy is hungry, your enemy, not your family member, not your friend, if your enemy, the person who brought that anger into your heart, if your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. You give him what he needs. And here's why, verse 22, because in doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. Now, what does that mean? Heap burning coals on his head. I know that's what you want to do, but it's a metaphor. It's not literal. That comes from the days when they would defend their cities from attacking armies by standing at the top of the wall. And when the enemy soldiers would try to scale the wall, they would take burning coals and they would dump them on the enemy soldiers, and that would repel the attack. And the idea here is that when you are kind to someone who has hurt you, you actually repel their animosity and their attacks toward you, because what you do is you appeal to their conscience. Can I tell you a little secret about how to change people? The way you change somebody is not to criticize them or be sarcastic toward them or try to belittle them and make them pay. Here's a gospel secret. The way that you change someone's heart is that you show them grace. And that will change them like nothing else. Look at the end of that verse. Not only will that affect them, but it also goes on to say that the Lord will reward you if you choose to bless those who hurt you. Now, how does God reward you when you do that? Very simple. He will drain the bitterness from your heart. He will drain the anger from your heart. He will set you free. And that is a far greater reward than any way that you could ever exact vengeance on the other person. You bless. You pause, you think, you respond, but then you bless. And let me tell you what, this is not easy. In fact, the deeper the pain, the harder this is. But I think there's only one way that you're going to find the power to do this. And the place where you find the power to bless someone who has hurt you is you find the power to do that in a personal experience with God's love and God's grace toward us. Because this is what happened to me. And this is what has happened to you. If you're a follower of Christ, here's what it says later in the Bible. In Colossians chapter 1, it says, speaking to Christians, once you were alienated from God and you were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight. When we were enemies of God, he chose grace. When we were enemies of God, he chose to meet our greatest need. And we can do that for others. So my friends, don't wreck your life. Don't do it. Don't let anger consume you. I want you to imagine something. Imagine what it would be like to move through the demands of your day, the traffic jams and the deadlines and the interruptions, and instead of giving in to anger, you just stop and you think and you realize what really matters in life. Imagine never again saying words that you regret, words that pierce the soul of another person. Imagine that. Imagine people hurting you, and instead of lashing back at them like a volcano or stuffing it inside like a trash compactor or just saving it up when you can get even like a stealth bomber, imagine that you just choose to forgive them. That is possible. It really is. It is possible to be good and angry. You just got to stop and think and respond and bless. Let me just ask you to stay seated. And I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. Just close out the people around you and the distractions around you. And I want you to think a little bit about your own heart and your own life. Because I'm sure some of you hearing this message, you have a pattern of hurting other people with your anger. And some of you have a resentment that you carry around with you that's poisoning your soul. And it's destroying you. And it's killing you. And there are people on every campus who just need to make some kind of decision today. Because Christ can give you the power to live differently. He can take the bitter waters of your heart and he can make them sweet again. But it all has to begin by surrendering to the one who loved you enough to die for you. And so I want to invite you, if you have never before crossed the line of faith and believed in Jesus Christ to be your forgiver and the leader of your life, if you're not yet a Christian, I want to give you the chance to become one today, to make that decision, to invite God to change you from the inside out. And in the quietness of your own seat and in your own heart, just pray a simple prayer, something along these lines. Dear Lord, I know that I am a broken person. I know that my heart has been corrupted by sin. Thank you for loving me enough to die for me. Today, I accept that forgiveness and I surrender my life to the Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. And let me pray for all of us. Father, thank you that your anger was something that you handled so perfectly on the cross, that you chose to destroy our sin without destroying us. When we deserved your anger, you gave us grace. When we were your enemies, you made us your sons and daughters. I thank you for that kind of love. I thank you that almost 2,000 years ago on a cross, your wrath and your love met where we could be forgiven. I pray that we would live in that truth and reflect that truth in our relationships. I pray that in Christ's name. Amen.